That's Melissa Crane screaming at the city workers as they jackhammer her brand new BMW off the train track. Yep, that's my crossing. And this is exactly what happens when an HOA blocks the only access point to a private rail spur and forgets who actually owns the land beneath it. Viewer, buckle up. You're probably wondering, wait, what? How does something like this even happen legally? And how the hell didn't she notice? Let me rewind, because trust me, you're going to need the full backstory to appreciate the absolute symphony of pettiness, paperwork, and poetic justice that led us to this glorious disaster. I live in Timber Falls Estates, a so-called gated community perched at the edge of Redstone County, about 45 minutes from Cascade City. I, Jack Whitmore, retired mechanical engineer and unapologetic train nut, bought this land over a decade ago. What made it special? Well, it came with something rare, a fully functional private rail spur that connects to the local industrial line. To most, it's a weird little curiosity. But to me, it's a legacy. My dad and I were obsessed with trains, vintage locomotives, diesel monsters, cabooses, all of it. When he passed, I inherited not only the antique rail cars, but the strange, wonderful hobby we shared. I even had a custom barn built near the edge of my land to house the engines and run short hauls for fun or restoration. The key to all of it? A 40-foot wide paved crossing with proper signage that links my property to the main track. That crossing is mine. It's grandfathered in, officially recorded with the local transportation authority, and recognized since the 1940s. Nobody cared. At least, not until Melissa Crane moved in. Melissa, age 52, freshly divorced, spiritually bitter, and professionally unsatisfied, bought a house here and immediately began organizing trash cleanup days, planting neighborhood pride signs, and preaching community unity like she was running for mayor of a place no one voted for. Within 6 months, she'd formed a homeowners association. You know the type: rules about grass height, mandatory mulch colors, and, of course, weaponized newsletters. Naturally, she crowned herself HOA president. At first, her reign was just annoying. Passive-aggressive memos and an obsessive vendetta against non-regulation mailboxes. Then, she set her sights on my rail spur, called it an eyesore and a danger to children, claimed my crossing, again, mine, was actually part of the neighborhood's shared space. Her logic? Now that the HOA existed, it had jurisdiction over common visual zones. I laughed. I thought it was satire. I handed her the land deed, the permit for the crossing, and the official documentation proving I owned the spur and the land beneath it. Melissa squinted at it, said the paperwork looked outdated, and waved it off like I'd shown her a grocery list. 1 week later, she installed orange construction barriers at the entrance to my spur. On my land. She even stapled a laminated HOA violation to my gate, demanding I cease all industrial activities within 7 days. When I confronted her, her exact words were, "You can't just have trains where people live. This is a community, not a scrapyard." She really tried to fine me for using my own property. I told her she was trespassing. Her reply? "We'll see what the board says." That board, by the way, was 3 people: Melissa, her sidekick Linda Cho, who hasn't smiled since 1998, and Ethan Ray, a guy who joined because he thought there'd be snacks. None of them had the faintest clue about land use law, but that didn't stop them from drafting grand plans. At the next HOA meeting, one I wasn't invited to, they unveiled their vision: convert the crossing into a community garden and playground. They even handed out flyers featuring a swing set placed directly over the tracks. One neighbor, Greg Sanders, bless him, asked, "Is that safe?" Melissa waved her hand and said the tracks were just symbolic and hadn't been used in years. Spoiler, I had used them 2 weeks before that meeting. You'd think the city would shut her down. Nope. Since the HOA wasn't technically removing infrastructure, but rather enhancing shared aesthetic space, they got a pass. They dumped gravel, laid fake turf, planted crepe myrtles right on the track, and installed a cute little bench. They called it reclaiming the landscape. I called it what it was: a hostile land grab in pastel gardening gloves. I didn't fight them, at least not right away. I let them get comfortable. Let them think they'd won. Because here's what Melissa didn't know: that outdated paperwork? I'd updated it 5 years ago during renovations. I had full maintenance rights, an active easement with Northern Pacific Rail, and legal grounds to enforce it. And soon, I'd have more than just enforcement rights. I'd have ownership. And that's when the real game began. They called it enhancing shared visual space. That was the HOA's excuse, their so-called justification for installing temporary landscaping over what they labeled non-essential easement areas. Melissa Crane, of course, had her own name for it, reclaiming the landscape. But I called it what it really was, a hostile land grab, dressed up in pastel garden gloves and smug righteousness. They dumped gravel. They rolled out fake turf like a red carpet for ignorance. They planted 2 crepe myrtles right on top of the active rail line. And to top it off, a quaint little wooden bench. A bench. On my property. On my rail spur. But here's the thing, I didn't stop them. Not right away. I let them get cozy in their delusions. I wanted them to think they'd finally erased the one thing that didn't fit into their cookie-cutter vision of Timber Falls Estates. I let them sip victory lattes and pose for community garden photos, because I knew what was coming. What Melissa didn't know, what Linda Cho and Ethan Ray didn't even bother to look into, was that the paperwork they laughed off as outdated had been refiled and fully updated 5 years ago. When I renovated the rail barn, I made sure everything was bulletproof. Full title, active maintenance rights, and a legally binding easement agreement with Northern Pacific Rail Company. The crossing wasn't just a charming relic. It was a recognized private industrial asset. If anyone obstructed it, I had the legal right to demand removal. And if they refused, I could sue, or better yet, enforce. So, I did what any quiet storm would do. I made calls. I requested a full land survey. I contacted the Regional Transportation Board. I pulled permits that hadn't seen daylight since dial-up internet. Slowly, deliberately, I laid the foundation for something beautiful, something undeniable. But I'll admit, this wasn't just about legality anymore. It was personal. Melissa wasn't just annoying. She was smug, condescending, the type of person who calls herself a leader while wielding a rulebook like a sword. She once referred to my father's antique caboose, the one he spent half his life restoring, as old junk cluttering the view. That was the moment the gloves came off. Then came the spark. One quiet Tuesday, a letter landed in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's official crest, thicker than the usual passive-aggressive paper stock. This wasn't from Melissa directly. It was from Linda Cho and Ethan Ray, her loyal lieutenants. The letter declared, in unified board agreement, that due to my continued noncompliance, the HOA had voted to authorize full removal of the derelict industrial zone. Contractors had already been scheduled. Demolition would begin in 30 days. And guess who they were paying with? HOA funds. Real money. From real neighbors. To tear up a legal, privately owned rail spur. That was the moment I stopped watching and started acting. Because what Melissa didn't know, what she never thought to check, was that her bold little letter triggered something. A clause buried deep in the original crossing agreement. A clause that, once violated, granted me full ownership, permanent, indisputable, untouchable. The land was mine now, not just to use, to control. So when Melissa parked her brand new BMW on the tracks that rainy morning, believing it was still just a decorative garden, believing she still ruled that space, she had no idea she'd just parked on ground that no longer belonged to the HOA. No clue the city crew she screamed it had been dispatched by me, and absolutely zero understanding of the legal firestorm she'd just sparked. But what came next, even I didn't see coming. Later that day, I opened another envelope. Again from the HOA board, not Melissa. For a brief second, I wondered, was this an apology? A peace offering? Nope. Inside was a formal declaration, typed and signed by Linda and Ethan, reaffirming the beautification initiative. They were doubling down. Included was a proposed work schedule from a landscaping firm, an itemized breakdown of costs, and, cherry on top, a handwritten note that read, "Community beautification begins June 1st. Thank you for your cooperation." I stared at it. Then I laughed. Not the laugh you give when something's funny. No, this was the kind of laugh that bubbles out when you realize someone just walked straight into a trap they built for you. I stopped replying to Melissa after that. There was no point arguing with someone who thought volume could beat documentation. I had something far better than words. I had proof. I had property rights. And I had a plan. Melissa Crane always believed that loud opinions could beat proper paperwork. She talked like authority was something you could conjure out of thin air, and the HOA board followed her blindly. But when they sent that letter, declaring their plans to demolish something they didn't even own without acknowledging a single one of my prior warnings, that was pure gold. Because now, it was in writing. They were officially moving forward with tearing up a piece of land they had zero legal claim to. I tucked the letter into my file drawer and made the phone call I'd been waiting to make. Valerie Knox, age 46, worked at the Regional Land Use Office for Northern Pacific Rail Company. I'd spoken with her years ago when I first bought the property, and again recently to confirm the deed was still in perfect standing. This time, I asked the question I'd never dared to until now. What would it take to purchase full title of the crossing outright? Not just usage rights. Not just easement privileges. Full, permanent ownership of the land itself. Turns out, it wasn't hard at all. The company had no long-term plans for that section of track, and since I'd been maintaining it myself for over a decade, they were happy to offload the liability. 2 weeks later, I had a signed agreement in hand. Just like that, I became the undisputed owner of the rail crossing and the surrounding access zone. The HOA couldn't touch it now. Not legally. Not even the city could contest it. They had to update their maps and acknowledge my property lines as final. I had my lawyer revise the records and file a public notice of private access restrictions. It wasn't flashy, just a few lines buried in the county filing system, but those lines had teeth. And when the dust settled, I filed for a temporary closure of the crossing, citing safety violations. Specifically, the presence of unpermitted structures like fencing, cement pavers, and decorative shrubbery, all installed by the HOA without authorization. The city signed off instantly. I showed them the survey, highlighted the blocked track, and just like that, those whimsical garden gnomes and faux flower beds became official obstructions on a private industrial access point. I posted a notice at the site. Crews would arrive the following week to clear the area and restore access. Melissa must have seen it. The very next day, I spotted her pacing around the garden, phone in hand, recording videos like she was uncovering some vast injustice. She actually uploaded one to the HOA's community Facebook page. In it, she stood beside a clump of roses, pointing at my sign like it was some villainous decree, and claimed I was dismantling a cherished public space by using outdated industrial law to bully the neighborhood. The comments were mixed. A few confused residents asked what was happening. The usual loyalists chimed in with "We stand with Melissa" and "Save the Greenway." I said nothing. I let her talk. I let her dig. But behind the scenes, I wasn't just clearing the track. I was laying the tracks for something bigger. While combing through old property documents, I stumbled on something almost too perfect, a forgotten easement behind the HOA's newly built walking trail. It connected to a thin strip of land they'd turned into a community park, complete with benches, a dog waste station, and a sad little gazebo. But according to official parcel maps, a narrow wedge of that land, maybe 10 feet wide, still belonged to me. It was left over from a decades-old parcel merger that had never been properly filed. And now, with the HOA using it for public access and gatherings, that meant they were infringing on my land again. But this time, I wasn't just going to complain. I sent them a formal notice of encroachment and followed it up with a cease and desist order for all non-permitted public use. If they wanted to keep their precious picnic zone, they'd need to lease it from me, legally, in writing, with terms. Of course, I knew they never would. Melissa Crane would set fire to that gazebo before admitting she'd made a mistake. But by putting everything in legal terms, I forced their hand. 1 week later, I got an email, not from Melissa, but from Linda Cho. It was short, polite, and carried a hint of nervousness, like she was finally realizing I wasn't bluffing. She asked for clarification about the easement and whether a friendly negotiation was still possible. I told her that, moving forward, all offers would have to go through my attorney. Melissa didn't like that one bit. She called an emergency HOA meeting and declared my documents fraudulent, claimed I was staging an industrial coup, accused me of manipulating old maps, and waved around a binder of printed screenshots from Google Maps as if that were somehow legally binding. I didn't show up. I didn't have to. The paperwork spoke louder than she ever could. Melissa Crane stood in front of the entire HOA meeting, binder in hand, full of printed Google Maps screenshots and sheer audacity. She accused me of fraud, of deliberately obstructing community resources, whatever that was supposed to mean. I only heard about the speech from my neighbor Greg Sanders, who'd sat in the back row just for the free donuts. According to him, Melissa went full soapbox, talking about preserving the soul of Timber Falls estates, about stopping industrial decay, about standing up for family values. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the moment she installed garden fencing across an active, legally registered rail access, the city stopped taking her seriously. And when she tried to escalate her complaint to the municipal zoning board, the person she got on the phone was none other than Officer Dana Liu, the same official who had signed off on my closure permit. I was told later that Melissa tried to bluff her way through the conversation, claiming the HOA had jurisdiction and that my documents were forged. Officer Liu's reported response? Ma'am, are you trying to tell me your HOA outranks the railroad? It was glorious. And around that same time, something shifted. People in the neighborhood, who had previously avoided eye contact or whispered behind hedges, started talking to me again. At first, it was awkward nods. Then one guy stopped while I was trimming a hedge and said, "Look, Jack." I didn't know what Melissa was doing. I just signed what they handed me. If I'd known you owned all that, I wouldn't have agreed to any of it. I didn't hold it against him. That's how Melissa operated, by making people believe they had no choice. But now, the cracks were showing. Still, Melissa wasn't done. 2 days after the work crew arrived to begin clearing the blocked track, I noticed something odd, a handwritten sign taped to one of the barricades. Black marker, all caps, slanted like it was scribbled in a fit of rage. It read, "Unauthorized work. This area is under HOA investigation. Cease immediately." And of course, signed by Melissa Crane, HOA president, as if her sharpest signature could override property law. But that wasn't even the best part. Behind the sign, I found something far more telling, a contractor invoice addressed to the HOA. Full official quote. Scheduled date, the following Monday. Scope of work? Removal of the rail spur. She was still trying to have it ripped out. This time, though, she was using HOA funds, real money, collected from real people, to destroy something she didn't own and had already been legally warned to leave alone. That invoice? That was the final straw, not just because it proved intent, but because it exposed her recklessness. I could already picture the fallout. A packed HOA meeting, angry residents discovering their dues had been funneled into an illegal demolition project targeting a historic, documented rail line, owned, operated, and protected by someone with a stack of permits and a very expensive attorney. But I didn't react, not yet. I didn't send a warning. I didn't confront her. I let her feel like she was still winning. Because what Melissa didn't understand, and never had, was that the law isn't just about paper. It's about timing. And hers had just run out. While she prepared her demolition fantasy, I finalized mine. The ownership paperwork? Done. The easement rights? Updated. But this time, I went a step further. I bought the entire crossing, gravel, lines, strip and all. And because the access point had previously been registered as a commercial rail spur, I re-registered it with the city under private commercial use and filed for a formal closure notice. In plain English, I now had the legal right to shut the area down indefinitely. No HOA vote required. No neighbor approval. No signature from Melissa. Just one line on a document, stamped, filed, and accepted by the city within 3 days. That's the thing about doing things by the book. It's slower, but when it lands like a freight train. Next came the signage. Professionally printed. Weatherproof. Bolted to steel posts that could survive a Category 5 hurricane. They read, "Private railroad crossing. No public access. Authorized entry only." I also installed gates. Steel. With electronic locks that synced to my phone. On the day they went up, a few neighbors wandered over, curious. I didn't say much. Just smiled and waved. I wanted the realization to spread slowly, organically. Like a whisper turning into a storm. The queen bee of the HOA might have been bluffing this whole time. By the weekend, the HOA newsletter arrived in mailboxes. Tucked at the bottom in tiny print was a line that said, "Greenway development paused due to unforeseen logistical complications. Melissa speak for." We got caught. The HOA newsletter landed in our mailboxes that Saturday. Tucked at the bottom in small font, like they were hoping no one would notice, was a line that read, "Community Greenway construction temporarily paused due to logistical considerations." Logistical considerations, huh? That was pure Melissa Crane speak for we got caught with our hands in the legal cookie jar. And while I'd love to say that was the beginning of Melissa's unraveling, that's just not who she is. Melissa isn't the unraveling type, she's the digging deeper type. When the walls close in, she just swings harder, louder, and with even less regard for reality. So naturally, she did what she always does. She doubled down. She announced a last-minute community walk-and talk. A PR stunt, plain and simple, meant to distract from the fact that her garden fantasy had been halted, her invoices were under scrutiny, and her golden playground plan had become a financial pit. The invitation promised coffee, ideas, and fresh air among the flowers. I decided to attend, not to stir trouble, just as a silent witness. Civilian attire, sunglasses, coffee cup in hand. She led a group of maybe 15 residents along the turf-covered rail line like it was some guided botanical tour. I stood near the new steel gate, just watching. When she got close, she locked eyes with me, and I swear, if looks could file restraining orders, I'd have been served on the spot. She pretended not to notice the gate, not the signs, not the obvious, glaring shift in ownership and control. But the crowd noticed. One by one, people started asking quiet questions. Why is the gate locked? Who put those signs up? What's going on with the crossing? Melissa pivoted faster than a scandal-plagued politician. She claimed it was a temporary safety measure due to undocumented infrastructure complications. Then, for the first time ever, she said it aloud that she was working closely with the property owner to resolve it. I nearly choked on my coffee. That right there was the first time Melissa Crane publicly admitted that I, Jack Whitmore, actually owned the land. It was a small win, but satisfying. Greg Sanders, contractor, neighbor, and donut enthusiast, spoke up. Is the HOA still planning to rip out the tracks? He asked. Melissa froze, then muttered something about evaluating all options. Translation? She had no idea what the hell to do next. But she wasn't done scheming. That very Monday, just before dawn, I spotted a landscaping crew rolling in. They parked near the garden, unloaded heavy equipment, and started taking measurements near the track. From my kitchen window, I watched. Calmly, I dialed the number printed on the side of the trailer. A man answered, cheerful, unsuspecting. Said they were hired to clear some old metal for a greenway project. I asked, who hired you? The HOA president, Melissa, something? I took a slow breath. Sir, you're standing on private property and preparing to dismantle a registered industrial rail spur. I have documentation proving ownership. If your team so much as loosens a single bolt, I'll be filing charges by lunchtime. There was a pause. Wait, are you serious? Dead serious. I'll be there in 10 minutes with a city inspector and a police liaison. He apologized. Hung up. 15 minutes later, the entire crew had vanished like they'd never been there. I wasn't bluffing. I had already briefed Officer Dana Liu the week before. The folder with maps, deeds, and permits was ready to go. I just didn't need to open it that day. But the fact that Melissa had secretly hired another contractor after all the legal warnings? That wasn't just stubborn. That was reckless. That afternoon, I sent an email, not to Melissa, but to the board. Linda Cho and Ethan Ray. It included the contractor invoice, a full timeline of Melissa's unauthorized actions, and a formal notification. Any further attempts to alter my property would be met with civil and, if necessary, criminal charges. I CC'd the city. I CC'd Northern Pacific Rail. I CC'd my attorney, an expert in land disputes with a reputation for treating lawsuits like fine art. Then I waited. 2 days later, Linda Cho resigned. No explanation, just gone. The next week, Ethan Ray followed. That left Melissa Crane as the sole remaining member of the HOA board, the president of a kingdom with no council, a queen with no court, and, increasingly, no support. Then came the real blow. The city issued a formal order to the Timber Falls Estates HOA. All development plans involving the crossing and surrounding greenway were to be suspended pending investigation into unauthorized construction, potential misuse of funds, and legal property disputes. The very thing she tried to build her legacy on was crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance. And this time, the entire neighborhood was watching. The investigation into misuse of HOA funds and unauthorized construction had officially begun. Melissa Crane was in full-blown damage control mode. She blasted out a neighborhood-wide email, full of bold fonts, vague accusations, and emotionally manipulative nonsense. She claimed outside forces were trying to sabotage community progress. She painted herself as a victim of harassment and, in a truly desperate twist, hinted at property fraud on my part. That was bold, considering the city already had every document on file: deeds, permits, correspondence, contracts. My case was built like a brick wall, and Melissa had just run headfirst into it. At full speed. But she wasn't done being dramatic. The very next weekend, I spotted her in front of the gate again, my gate, planting fresh signs in the muddy grass. They read things like protected community garden, do not disturb, and no trespassing, HOA property. She slapped one right on the gate like she owned the place. So I did the only logical thing. I hired a crew. They legally removed every unauthorized sign, filmed the entire process for documentation, and, while they were at it, installed a large, very obvious surveillance camera facing the crossing. No hidden wires, no subtle placement. Just a big, bold camera mounted to a steel post with enough presence to make even the most self-righteous HOA president think twice before wandering too close. And it worked. Melissa started unraveling. But then, something strange happened. That evening, as I was locking up the rail barn, I noticed something taped to my mailbox. It wasn't a letterhead memo. It wasn't printed. It was a torn piece of notebook paper, hastily scrawled in thick, uneven handwriting. 3 words, "You'll regret this." No signature. No return address. Just chicken scratch writing and the desperate sin of someone losing control. I stood there in the driveway, holding that scrap of paper like it might catch fire. I wasn't scared. Not really. Melissa wasn't subtle, and she certainly wasn't clever enough to be dangerous. But it wasn't the threat that got to me, it was the sheer audacity of it. After months of lies, illegal construction, forged invoices, and delusional power grabs, she still thought she had the upper hand. As if through sheer force of will and enough HOA stationery, she could undo everything I had already carved in stone, filed, sealed, notarized, and triple-backed with city approval. Fine. If she wanted to play games, I was done playing defense. That week, I filed one final piece of paperwork. A formal land use restriction, recorded with the county, designating the rail crossing and the surrounding access zone as private property closed to non-authorized traffic indefinitely, under infrastructure preservation. The document went through without a hitch. Within 48 hours, a city crew arrived to reinforce the gate, install new signage, and place reflective markers along the entire property line. I didn't need to do it. I wanted to. A final, satisfying punctuation mark at the end of the longest passive-aggressive sentence in Timber Falls Estates history. And then came the cherry on top. The rain. That Friday, a freak storm rolled in out of nowhere. The kind that turns dusty roads into soup and low-lying parks into lakes. The neighborhood, like always, was unprepared. Melissa's beloved community greenway sat in the lowest part of the entire development. And years ago, when they planted those cursed crepe myrtles, they filled in the original drainage ditch that used to run through the area. That wasn't just poor planning. That was arrogance, dressed up as landscaping. The storm dumped several inches of rain in just a few hours. The garden turned lawn turned playground. It transformed into a swamp. Water had nowhere to go. But the crossing? The one I'd built up and maintained with proper drainage, proper grading, and actual infrastructure? Bone dry. Everything else? A muddy mess. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was a neighbor, Greg Sanders, laughing so hard I could barely make out the words between wheezes. "You're not gonna believe this," he gasped. "Melissa's brand new BMW? It's stuck. On the tracks." Apparently, in some kind of bizarre power move, or maybe just plain denial, Melissa had driven onto the crossing during a last-minute emergency photo op for the HOA's Facebook page. She was trying to prove the greenway was still safe and accessible during inclement weather. What she didn't realize was that the weight of her own ego, combined with German engineering and unstable soil, was a recipe for disaster. She'd parked smack in the middle of soft clay, half a foot deep, right between 2 steel rails. And there it was, her shiny white BMW, sinking. Her power, her plan, her pride, all bogged down in the mud, literally and figuratively. The garden? Flooded. The tracks? Secure. Melissa Crane? Officially out of moves. German engineering wasn't built for unstable soil and a blocked drainage system. I drove down to the crossing just in time to see the city crew pulling in, ready to jackhammer the cracked concrete slab that had buckled near the edge of the spur. What they weren't expecting was a luxury SUV. Melissa Crane's brand new BMW, sitting smack in the middle of the work zone. The look on her face? A cocktail of panic, fury, and pure disbelief. She started flailing her arms like she was directing traffic in a disaster movie, barking orders, telling the crew to leave. But they had their instructions. My instructions. The permit was on file. The area was marked as restricted and under official construction. which meant her car wasn't just stuck, it was illegally parked on a municipal work site. One of the crew members gave me a look, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Want us to call a tow?" I didn't even have to answer. Melissa was already on her phone, shouting about sabotage, liability, and something about criminal intent. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors with umbrellas, a few curious teens filming on their phones. One of them was live streaming. I know because my niece sent me the clip later that afternoon. It went semi-viral on local socials. There she was, Melissa Crane, HOA president, up to her ankles in soggy mulch and shame, screaming at public employees while her $70,000 car slowly tilted, sinking deeper into the soaked clay. I didn't say a word, just stood there, arms crossed, watching the end of a very long, very stupid chapter play out like theater. The tow truck arrived 2 hours later. It took 3 chains and some careful maneuvering to haul the car out without tearing the undercarriage to shreds. By then, the crossing had been fully cleared, re-cemented, and cleaned. The city crew even gave it a fresh coat of paint, bright white lines, new reflectors. It looked like a model train set, polished and perfect. That night, I installed a second security camera, this one aimed at the street. Not because I expected more trouble. Melissa was out of moves. But I wanted a front row seat in case she ever decided to get creative again. And just like that, the tide shifted. Within a week, residents were openly criticizing her on the HOA message board. No more vague complaints. Just direct, undeniable backlash. Ethan Ray, the former treasurer, posted a detailed breakdown of the Greenway budget. Every dollar spent. Every invoice. Melissa's signature on every line. The landscape crew she had hired? They filed a breach of contract claim. Neighbors started circulating a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. Melissa Crane had already done the damage herself. All I had to do was let the paperwork, and the puddles, speak for me. A few days later, Ethan stopped by my place to drop off a misdelivered package. He looked exhausted. Said he never wanted to be part of the HOA in the first place. Thought it'd just be a few lawn rules, he muttered. Didn't think I was signing up for a full-blown turf war. He chuckled, glanced at the track, and said, "She really thought she could steamroll a guy who owns his own train." I offered him a beer. We didn't talk much after that. Didn't need to. Some things don't require speeches. They just need time. And rain. And a healthy dose of poetic justice. Melissa moved out 3 months later. No farewell party. No tantrum. Just a U-Haul, a scowl, and the fading scent of defeat in her wake. Word has it she tried starting another HOA in her new neighborhood. This time, the residents shut her down before she could hold the first meeting. Turns out news travels fast when your legacy is built on concrete and drowned in karma. As for me, I reopened the Spur a few weeks later. Took the old locomotive out for a gentle ride, just to stretch her wheels. A few neighbors came out. Some waved. A couple brought their kids to watch. No admission. No grand performance. Just a slow roll. A nod to the past. A quiet victory lap. And, of course, I had one last touch installed at the crossing, a hand-pulled steam whistle. Old-fashioned. Heavy brass. Just loud enough to echo through Timber Falls. Every Saturday at 9 a.m., I give it a good blast. Not out of spite. Not exactly. Just tradition. A weekly reminder that some things aren't dictated by rulebooks or board votes. They're earned by patience, persistence, and a working railroad. Oh, and if you're wondering whether Melissa ever came back, she didn't. But last week, I got a letter. Typed. Polite. From a real estate agent representing the newly restructured HOA. They were hoping to discuss the possibility of leasing access to the park trail, still technically crossing my land. They said they wanted to rebuild trust with the community. I haven't responded. I'm thinking about it. After all, I've got time. And a train whistle.